Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take a stack of sources, articles, research, your notes, and really try to cut through the noise.
Yeah, find the important stuff, the nuggets of knowledge.
Exactly. And today, we're doing a deep dive into a truly pivotal period in modern history.
Right.
The final years of British rule in Hong Kong, leading right up to the 1997 handover to China.
And what's unique about this dive is the lens we're using.
Yeah.
Our source material, it's taken from the personal diaries of the last British governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it gives us this incredible inside look, what it was like navigating the end of an empire, dealing with Beijing, living in Government House during those final intense years. It's quite something.
So our mission today is to unpack the key events, the pressures, the tensions, the surprising moments, and the insights that just jump off these pages. What was the reality of the situation? And what can you, the listener, take away from this unique historical moment?
It's a story filled with high-stakes diplomacy, clashing values, and, the fate of millions hanging in the balance.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with how Chris Patten kind of unexpectedly ended up as the final governor.
It really was a surprising turn. The Diaries, they start right after the 1992 UK general election. The Conservative Party, led by John Major, won a victory most people hadn't predicted.
Right, but Patten himself actually lost his seat in that election.
Exactly. And according to the Diaries, the very next morning after the Conservative win and his own personal defeat, he was called to Downing Street by John Major. He was offered a few options, various ministerial jobs.
But then Hong Kong came up.
Yes. Patten writes that almost the moment Major mentioned
See, governorship, yeah.
the possibility of the governorship, it just seemed like the best and most exciting of all the possible choices.
Yeah.
It was a challenge he'd clearly thought about before and found, well, exceptionally attractive.
That's fascinating. Trading a likely cabinet post for, essentially, the end-of-empire job in Hong Kong.
So he gets the job, and he has about 10 weeks before he arrives. How does he prepare? Well, he describes spending a good chunk of that time in a small room at the Foreign Office in London, just crunching through briefing papers. He was clearly impressed by the quality of the Foreign Service staff he met. He singles out Peter Ricketts, who was then head of the Hong Kong department, calls him a star, clever, sensible, amiable, and, really well-informed.
A contrast, I guess, to the sort of stereotypical view of diplomats sometimes.
Precisely. He notes it's quite different from the populist nonsense you might read in the tabloids, that sort of thing. It suggests the British officialdom dealing with Hong Kong was actually, well, perhaps quite capable and informed.
He officially takes up his duties on July 5th, 1992. What about Government House itself? What do the diaries tell us about where he was living and working?
The source gives us a few vivid details. It was built way back in 1855, described as more oriental-looking than you might expect from a typical colonial building. But by the 90s, it was completely dwarfed by the surrounding skyscraper.
A physical metaphor for the changing times, maybe?
Possibly, yeah. He found the inside large and spacious, but initially described the decoration as, well, dreary. He mentions getting furniture from interesting places, like finding an ornate altar table and this huge wickerwork dresser on the back streets of Kowloon, and borrowing paintings from the Museum of Art to try and make it feel more like a home. It paints a picture of this grand old building, but now stuck in a rapidly modernizing, bustling city.
So he's in this historic building, surrounded by modern Hong Kong, and he's got this incredibly complex political situation to navigate. On one hand, you have these frameworks like the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law.
Right, those set the broad parameters for the handover. But Patten quickly realized, and the diaries really emphasized this, that there was actually much more flexibility than some people seem to suppose within those agreements.
Oh.
The question was, how much could you realistically use that flexibility, especially given, Beijing's stance?
And he wasn't just dealing with Beijing, was he? The diaries give us this fascinating glimpse into the different perspectives within the British side itself, particularly in the Foreign Office.
Oh yeah, he categorizes them almost into factions, I guess.
Yeah.
There were the older Sinophiles who, having spent years dealing with China, felt the most pragmatic approach was ultimately just to go along with Beijing.
Right. Okay.
He mentions figures like Sir Christopher Hum and Percy Craddock as examples of this school of thought.
So just try not to rock the boat, that kind of thing.
Essentially. Then there was a middle group, closer to Patten's own age, who were prepared for more assertive negotiations, what he calls hand-to-hand combat. And then a younger, more energetic group who believed Britain should occasionally flex our own muscles. Patten writes he got increasingly cross about the constant talk of needing to save Chinese face,
Yeah.
feeling it was necessary to remember British face from time to time, you know?
That internal dynamic must have added another layer of complexity to his decisions.
Yeah.
What about the Hong Kong political structure he was inheriting? What did that look like?
Well, in the 1990s, you had the Executive Council, or EXCO. That was appointed directly by the governor. Think of it like an advisory cabinet, sort of.
Okay.
Then there was the Legislative Council, LegCo. This was the lawmaking body. By the 90s, it was a mix of appointed members and members who were either directly elected from geographical constituencies or elected through what were called functional constituencies.
Functional constituencies. Those were seats elected by specific professional or business groups. Or...
Exactly. They were often seen as less democratic than direct geographical elections, and, well, they became a key area of contention later on. The Basic Law laid out the framework for 60 members post-1997, including increasing direct elections, but still using those functional constituencies and an election committee.
And there was also the Bill of Rights. That came in just before him.
Yes, enacted in 1991. This was significant because it incorporated the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, into Hong Kong law,
Right.
which is a major international human rights treaty. So incorporating it was a big deal for strengthening legal protections for rights and freedoms in Hong Kong.
So you have this really intricate web, international agreements, different British viewpoints, this evolving local political system, including a Bill of Rights, all under the huge pressure cooker of the impending 1997 handover.
Yeah.
This complex environment is where the major clashes kicked off, wasn't it?
Right. One early issue was the massive airport project at Cheklapkok. Patten saw it as plainly daft to start the huge land reclamation work before getting the overall financial package agreed upon with China.
Why was that so crucial? What was the risk?
Because China used the airport issue as immense leverage. They dragged out negotiations, and as the source notes, they even demanded Prime Minister John Major visit Beijing, where Patten observed Major got damn all for his pains. Beijing clearly wanted an arm lock on Hong Kong, as he put it, and the airport was a key tool for them.
But the really explosive issue, the one that defined Patten's governorship for...
Was political reform. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Patten's proposals for the 1994 and 1995 elections for LegCo were the core of the conflict. He laid out these ideas to EXCO and LegCo, making a point of telling the Hong Kong people first and then discussing them with Beijing.
Okay.
Acknowledging changes might be needed, but crucially, not seeking Beijing's permission before presenting them in Hong Kong. That was a significant shift.
And China's reaction was...
Well, it was not subtle.
Far from it. Liu Ping, the head of Beijing's Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office, engaged in what Patten calls saber-rattling. Beijing had a whole list of complaints. They weren't consulted enough. Patten wasn't giving them face. The proposals were out of step with the Basic Law.
They threatened a vigorous attack and even linked it to other international events, viewing what was happening in Hong Kong as part of some international conspiracy against China.
Seriously, they connected it to what?
Bizarrely, yeah. To things like U.S. X-16 sales to Taiwan or visits by U.S. officials like Carla Hills.
Wow. Seeing Hong Kong's internal political process as part of a global plot against China, that's quite a perspective.
That's how it comes across in the diaries, reflecting a deep suspicion and, I guess, a zero-sum mindset in Beijing. They demanded Patten keep quiet until his proposals were cleared with them first.
The source also describes the negotiation process itself as incredibly difficult, like almost impossible.
Difficult is an understatement. Patten details these frustrating rounds of talks where the Chinese side seemed to be constantly backpedaling fast. He describes the rules of negotiation as feeling like they were written by Lewis Carroll.
Lewis Carroll, how so?
Well, where simply explaining what something meant required you to make a concession. Concepts Britain saw as basic, like openness, accuracy, and transparency, were incredibly regarded as concessions China might grant, not as standard practice.
That sounds maddening. How do you even negotiate like that?
It really highlights the fundamental difference in approach, doesn't it? The British side was trying to negotiate within a framework of established agreements and, common diplomatic language. The Chinese side seemed to be operating on entirely different principles, viewing the process itself through a lens of power and control, not mutual agreement on shared principles.
And this fed into issues like the through train concept, right? This idea of the 95 LegCo continuum.
Yes, exactly. The idea was that the LegCo elected in 1995, if elected under fair rules, could continue on the through train and become the first post-1997 LegCo. Now, while accepting an oath of allegiance to the Tsar was possible, the non-negotiable point for Patten was retrospection,
Retrospection, meaning what?
meaning Beijing's desire to apply new criteria or rules retrospectively to undermine or remove people who had already been elected under the existing system. That Patten refused to budge on.
And the underlying Chinese position on elections generally. There's a striking quote cited in the diaries about that.
Ah, yes, from David Akers-Jones. He was a former chief secretary who later became a Beijing advisor. He gave evidence to the House of Commons saying, "The Chinese style is not to rig elections, but they do like to know the results before they are held."
Wow. That tells you pretty much everything you need to know, doesn't it?
Precisely. The source indicates Beijing was simply unwilling to agree to anything even moderately fair and acceptable when it came to the actual election mechanisms.
Navigating this wasn't just about high-level talks in Beijing or London, though. Patten was also dealing with different groups within Hong Kong society itself. The business community, for instance, seemed particularly, well, cautious.
That's a polite way to put it, yeah. The diaries describe them as very nervous, often criticizing Patten sometimes for being too weak, then suddenly too tough. Their priority, Patten notes, seemed to be the following day and the profits they can make. They saw elections as something that didn't belong on a balance sheet and worried deeply about potential consequences from Beijing if they were seen to be supporting anything Beijing disliked.
So daily profits kind of trumped political principles for many in that group.
It certainly comes across that way in the source material. He contrasts this with figures like Jimmy McGregor, a businessman and LECO member who was apparently thrown off a committee for supporting fair elections.
Right.
He also mentions Rupert Murdoch, who had media interests in the region, and Riley questions whether a foreign owner might actually be more resilient against Beijing's pressure on, say, broadcasting freedom compared to a local entrepreneur whose entire business is focused on access to the China market. Makes you think.
On the other side, you have the pro-democracy politicians and activists. How were his interactions with them?
Well, he interacted frequently with figures like Martin Lee and Emily Lau. He writes that while he sometimes found them a bit aggravating, which you can maybe understand in the circumstances,
Sure.
he ultimately identified with their core values. He understood their passion for issues like the Bill of Rights and standing up to China. He also engaged with Alan Lee's party, noting their complex tactical considerations regarding the election bills. The political landscape was fluid, Figures like Sir S.Y. Chung, who'd been a stalwart under previous governors but felt badly treated by London, ended up becoming a key advisor to Beijing.
And the civil service.
Yeah.
Often seen as the backbone of Hong Kong's success. How are they navigating all this?
Incredibly important. Anson Chan, the chief secretary, is described as absolutely central to his work. Patten calls her a real brick. She saw the civil service as fundamental to Hong Kong's success and its values.
Yeah.
The diaries reflect real concerns about Beijing potentially wanting to remove key department secretaries after the handover, or requiring civil servants to support the provisional legislature that China planned to install.
Right, the body that would replace LegCo.
Exactly. Anson Chan even made speeches criticizing that provisional body, apparently without official sanction from London at the time, which showed considerable courage. Later, she played a key role trying to reassure Americans about C.H. Tung, the first chief executive chosen by Beijing.
And John Tsang, who later became a prominent figure himself, he worked closely with Patten.
Yes. John Tsang served as Patten's private secretary initially and is described as fitting in brilliantly, a real class act. He went on, as you say, to become financial secretary under the Starr government and later stood for chief executive himself. The diaries note his popularity, but his eventual defeat by the Beijing-picked election committee, which really highlights that tension between popular will and the reality of the post-handover system. Donald Tsang also served as financial secretary before becoming the second chief executive. The third CE, C.Y. Long, is mentioned briefly and just described as unpopular.
It sounds like amidst all this political drama, there was still significant public support for Patten on the ground.
He certainly records very warm receptions during his district visits, places like Shatin and Eastern District. He notes the stark contrast between this public enthusiasm and the often difficult press calls he faced.
Interesting.
He speculates this positive public mood might have been linked to the strong economy at the time. Inflation and unemployment were down, the Hang Seng Index was up, crime was lower. Good times often make people feel more optimistic, right?
True. The diaries also touch on social issues beyond the high politics, don't they?
Yes, Patten writes about focusing on areas like social welfare and education. There were plans for a new old age pension scheme, for instance, with a substantial government contribution, around HK $10 billion.
Okay.
Lavender Patten, his wife, also played a significant role. She engaged with causes like family law and the Society for AIDS Care. She visited the Down Syndrome Center and even faced this bizarre demonstration and threat of urine
Oh,
bags.
seriously?
Yeah, though apparently the vast majority of residents were supportive, just shows the strange pressure sometimes.
And the incredibly difficult issue of the Vietnamese migrants. That was still ongoing.
Oh, that was a major challenge throughout the 90s. The diaries detail the complexities of the camps, the controversial policy of mandatory returns to Vietnam, the legal challenges, and the significant opposition from various international and local groups. They were aiming to get the numbers in the camps close to zero by 1997, a huge logistical and humanitarian task.
It wasn't just politics and policy. There were moments of real-life capture, too, weren't there? Tragic moments, even.
Absolutely. He mentions specific events that remind you these were real people living through this period, like the tragic Lan Kwai Fong crush on New Year's Eve 1993.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Terrible.
Or Lavender visiting a women's prison.
Yeah.
It grounds the high politics in human reality.
As 1997 loomed closer, the pressure must have been just immense.
It really was. The diaries reflect that stress, including Patton's own health issues. He had heart problems leading to balloon angioplasty. He makes a wry note in the diary that perhaps this would at least stop the Chinese from arguing he didn't have a heart.
Huh. That's classic Patton. Right. How did they decide to handle Beijing's continued opposition as the deadline approached? What was the strategy?
He describes a remorselessness about China's pursuit of its goals. The conclusion reached with his officials was basically simply to do what we think is going to be best for Hong Kong wherever we can, acknowledging that warming relations with Beijing, which some in London desired, effectively meant doing whatever the CCP wants, which was unlikely to be in Hong Kong's best interests.
And China's plan to simply replace the elected Leiko with their own body.
Yes, the widely anticipated creation of a provisional legislature. While it seemed inevitable China would do this, the firm British position, reinforced by Foreign Secretary Malcolm Rifkind in some pretty strong exchanges with his Chinese counterpart Chiang Kai-shek, was that Britain must not have any fingerprints all over its establishment. They refused to agree to anything that would undermine the Hong Kong police or give entree to the Chinese security forces. Rifkind even had to push back against Chinese claims that Patten was encouraging demonstrations against it.
Another contentious issue right near the end was the British nationality selection scheme. The BNSS passports. What happened there?
Right. This scheme was designed to prevent a brain drain and panic by offering a limited number of qualified Hong Kong residents a route to British nationality, basically a safety net. Suddenly, China made a huge fuss about it,
How so?
refusing to recognize ethnic Chinese holders of these British passports as British citizens unless they could prove UK residency before the handover.
Wow, that sounds like it created chaos and uncertainty, right, when people needed certainty.
It did, exactly. It caused confusion and required urgent clarification from London to ensure these passport holders would indeed receive full consular protection from British missions abroad after 1997. The source notes an initial wishy-washy statement from London actually had to be corrected to make that clear.
Then just months before the handover, Deng Xiaoping dies in February 1997. Did that change the dynamic at all?
It's noted in the diaries, of course, but without any immediate clarity on how it would affect the balance of power or policy within Beijing. Patten did sign the condolence book at the NCNA, which was basically Beijing's de facto embassy in Hong Kong, though officially it was a news agency.
Right.
He also observes former Prime Minister Ted Heath making some pretty controversial remarks defending the Tiananmen Square crackdown on the BBC around this time.
In those final months, especially after the UK elected a new Labour government under Tony Blair, did things feel different from London's perspective?
Patten observed what he calls a slither and slide in London. He felt officials back home weren't paying as much attention anymore, and there was this belief growing, it seems, that to improve relations with China, they needed to avoid mentioning sensitive topics like Hong Kong's freedoms, to avoid annoying Beijing leaders. He felt some officials were ready to abandon any last-ditch efforts to support Hong Kong's autonomy. A sense of drift, maybe.
Which brings us right to the final days themselves and the handover ceremony. Planning that must have been tricky.
Oh, planning the ceremony was fraught. The goal was a joint ceremony, but also a separate British farewell at dusk on June 30th. Patten found the Chinese side tricky on details, trying to involve Britain in aspects of the Tsar inauguration that felt, well, unsavory.
Like what?
The source doesn't detail specifics, just that feeling. Anson Chan, ever practical, agreed that a competent Hong Kong civil servant, Stephen Lamb, should take charge of organizing the British side of things.
What about the new British Prime Minister, Tony Blair? Did he attend?
Yes, he ultimately decided to come. Patten felt this was the right decision, believing Blair wouldn't want Britain to appear humiliated by Beijing by not showing up.
Makes sense. What were those final weeks like on the ground? Must have been intense.
Filled with farewell events, yeah. Dinners with exco members, with senior civil service officers. The last Legco Q&A session, where he received a pewter tankard gift, and Sang Yat-seng of the pro-Beijing DABHK party gave what Patten called a characteristically brave speech, drawing applause from across the political spectrum. He opened infrastructure projects, like a new town near the future airport at Cheklapkok. One particularly poignant moment he describes is a surprise Sunday Mass at a Catholic church in Shatin, where the Hong Kong Sinfonia and Choir performed Haydn's Nelson Mass, also known as Missa in Angustius Latin, for Mass in times of difficulty.
Wow. That sounds incredibly symbolic for that specific moment.
It really does. And then the farewell ceremony on June 30th itself.
How does he describe that?
The diaries describe it vividly. An honor guard of police, a royal salute, the Union flag lowered for the very last time to the sound of sunset and the last post. As the flag was carefully folded and presented to him, the police pipes played Highland Cathedral.
Powerful imagery.
He then stepped into the car to the tune of Auld Lang Syne, driving through the pouring rain and cheering crowds to the quayside.
A very British farewell indeed.
Yeah.
In the rain.
Yes, and then departing on the royal yacht Britannia with Prince Charles. Despite rough weather, the Royal Navy's task force, called Ocean Waves, appeared 16 ships, the largest British fleet seen in those waters for years.
Really? 16 ships?
Yeah. Britannia led the convoy out, then passed between the two columns of ships with crews cheering from the decks. Patten describes it as an extraordinary occasion, likely the last time that a royal yacht will pass through the fleet, noting the slightly mystified Chinese intelligence ships following them at a distance.
It feels like the end of a chapter, doesn't it? Both personally for him and historically. Looking back from the perspective of writing the diaries later, what were Patten's reflections on it all?
He shares his own predictions for the year immediately after the handover. He thought he would become pretty irrelevant, that people in Hong Kong would avoid making a fuss, the international community would probably turn a blind eye,
Right.
and what he calls alleged pragmatism would lead to ignoring bad Chinese behavior, particularly regarding the Legislative Council and the Bill of Rights.
Sadly, some of their predictions seems to have, well, borne out over the years.
He nonetheless stresses his determination to keep singing the same tunes, not to give up advocating for Hong Kong's autonomy and freedoms, asking how things will look in 5 years, because the long term is what matters. This is a core insight from the diaries, the importance of sticking to principles and taking the long view, even when the immediate future looks pretty bleak.
And he did revisit Hong Kong later, didn't he? What were those experiences like?
Yes. He describes talking to students, including discussions about independence versus autonomy. He notes critically that apparently no one from the Hong Kong government or Beijing had bothered to engage with these students to try and persuade them away from a more confrontational position.
A missed opportunity.
Predictably, he felt this allowed hardliners in Beijing to just use any calls for independence to simply disparage the entire democracy movement. He felt that a Rubicon had been crossed and the die was cast by this lack of engagement.
He also connects this history to more recent events, right, in the later parts of the diaries.
He does. He sees China's behavior over the coronavirus outbreak, for instance, as a stark reminder of the regime's untrustworthiness and secrecy, as he puts it. He also touches on the ideology of figures like Wang Huning, seen as a key ideologue in Beijing.
Wang Huning?
Yeah, whose critique of Western liberal values forms a basis for what Patten sees as an ongoing assault on liberal values globally.
Including things like the campaign against wealthy tech billionaires in China.
Yes, which Patten argues is framed as a campaign for social equity, but fundamentally ignores what he sees as the real reason for inequality, the Chinese Communist Party's unaccountable power. These later reflections really tie back to the core value clash he experienced daily during his governorship.
The source also includes notes on what happened to some of the key figures later on.
Right. We mentioned Anson Chan serving as chief secretary post-handover, John Tsang and Donald Tsang serving as financial secretary and then chief executive, and C.Y. Leung as the unpopular third CE. John Tsang's unsuccessful bid for CE, despite clear public popularity, against Beijing's choice. Well, that really underscored the limitations of the post-handover political system that Patten had wrestled with.
Right.
British diplomats like Peter Ricketts are noted as having successful careers afterwards. And figures he dealt with directly from Beijing, like Lu Ping and Zhu Nan, they left their Hong Kong-related posts not long after the handover.
So this deep dive into Chris Patten's diaries gives us this incredibly personal, yet historically significant view of the end of British rule in Hong Kong. It highlights that clash between fundamentally different value systems, the immense challenges of negotiating with a power like Beijing.
Yeah, and the pressures on Hong Kong society and its civil service, and that constant struggle to build democratic institutions in the face of really determined resistance.
It shows moments of deep frustration and tension, clearly, but also moments of real connection with the people of Hong Kong and glimpses of the values Patten was trying to protect and maybe embed.
Absolutely. The source makes clear that navigating this period required not just diplomatic skill, but also a deep well of principle and resilience, a really tough balancing act.
And understanding this period is just vital for understanding the situation in Hong Kong today, isn't it? The ongoing relationship with mainland China and these broader global questions about freedom, autonomy, governance, and the challenges posed by authoritarian regimes.
Definitely. Patten's point about the long term being what matters and the need to keep singing the same tunes for democracy and freedom, even when it's hard, is a powerful takeaway, I think.
And to leave you with a thought from the source material, something Patten himself was asked by students years later and apparently struggled to fully answer. What would supporters of democracy outside Hong Kong do if Beijing attempted to destroy the democratic cause within Hong Kong?
It's a heavy question, one that echoes the anxieties of the 1990s and remains incredibly relevant today, unfortunately.
Something definitely worth considering. We hope this deep dive has given you valuable insights into this complex and crucial moment in history.